Just over 7 years ago, on December 4th, 2017, Scott Cawthon released Freddy Fazbear's Pizzeria Simulator. This game was the end of the original Scott Games era and had the answers to most of the questions we still had about the franchise back then, which were told to us through voice recordings, background details, and most importantly of all, arcade games. FNAF 6 had 3 iconic games that, if played in a specific way, would lead the player to different secrets where they could find hidden lore. Once all 3 of these secrets are found, the player is awarded the Lorekeeper certificate and shown an image of the graves of the 5 victims of the missing children incident, along with a secret 6th one in the distance. 2 out of 3 of these minigames were fairly simple. One, Security Puppet, was about Charlotte Emily, the girl who possesses the puppet, and the other, Fruity Maze, was about Susie, one of the victims of the missing children incident. And then there was Midnight Motorist. Seriously, why have we never been able to solve this? FNAF 6 was supposed to give us all the answers we needed to wrap up the story of Five Nights at Freddy's, and yet this single loose thread has bugged hundreds of thousands of people for over half a decade at this point. Today, I'm here to wrap up my personal Midnight Motorist saga in an attempt to solve the minigame, at least in my perception of it. It all started with the video where I proposed that the green guy outside Junior's was William Afton planning to kidnap the Runaway, and this theory has since become one of my most iconic videos on the channel. Then there was the video where I said the footprints outside the Yellow Man's house belonged to Shadow Bonnie, and that the Runaway was the crying child. Then there was the time I gathered some of the best FNAF theorists in the space to talk about Midnight Motorist, which resulted in us talking about everything except Midnight Motorist. And now we're here. My objective today is to figure out what this minigame was by connecting it to what we knew about the franchise when FNAF 6 first came out. I want to focus purely on why this minigame was created and what it was meant to solve back when we got Freddy Fazbear's Pizzeria Simulator, using the clues we had back then in an attempt to understand what Scott was trying to tell us and solve Midnight Motorist for real. I'm WitheredCircle, and this is what Scott Cawthon wanted Midnight Motorist to mean. I'm sure all of you know the broad strokes of the secret Midnight Motorist arcade game. If you go to the bottom of the map on the 4th lap, you'll find a secret minigame called Later That Night, which allows you to explore 3 key locations: a clearing with a mound of dirt, a bar called Junior's, and the area around your house. After trying to get inside your son's room, you go outside and see the window broken with 2 sets of footprints, one human and one animatronic leading away from it. And that's it. This minigame is definitely one of the weirdest parts of the entire franchise, because when FNAF 6 came out, we had no idea what this thing was about. No clues, no visual indicators, and no specific locations. The other minigames have clear locations and people in place, but Midnight Motorist is one big question mark. The big 5 things we've been theorizing about surrounding this minigame are the identity of the Mustard Man and where he's driving from, what the pile of dirt is, what Junior's is, who the Runaway and the Couch Person are, and who created the footprints outside the window. Everything else can be derived from these things, which means these 5 questions are what will lead us to figuring out the truth about Midnight Motorist. Today, I'm here to do my best to answer these questions. Let's start with the first and arguably easiest question. Who are we playing as, and where are we driving from? Ever since FNAF 6 came out, this discussion has been split into 2 camps. The theorists who think the Mustard Man is William Afton, and the ones who think it's someone else, usually the father of one of William's victims. While there used to be no concrete way to answer this question, we now have one. Last year, in early August, we got the demo for 5 Laps at Freddy's, which confirms that the purple car we see in this minigame belongs to William Afton. We also saw this purple car during FNAF 2's Take Cake to the Children minigame, so I suppose this was just the final piece of evidence needed to answer this question. There's also the fact that the blue house we walk into looks very similar to the one from FNAF 4's menu screen. There's still some people who are skeptical about whether we should use 5 Laps at Freddy's to solve FNAF 6's lore, but to be honest, since this evidence comes from an official piece of FNAF media, we might as well embrace it. And if we're proven wrong later, that's fine, it's just a silly bear game after all. Even without 5 laps, Take Cake to the Children and the name Later That Night seem to strongly indicate this is about William Afton. So if it's about him, why isn't he purple? One of the biggest problems people had with Mustard Man being William is that he's, well, mustard. William has been depicted as being purple in all of his appearances, even after FNAF 6. So why should this be any different? Well, I think there's a pretty clear reason for this, to differentiate him from his son Michael. After Sister Location's Custom Night came out and Michael was revealed to become a purple corpse, a lot of people theorized that he was the purple guy. Obviously this was wrong, and Scott himself had to step in and clear up this misconception. So what if the reason William is orange in this minigame is to make it clear this is specifically William and not his son? My friend Cyanide proposed this in a video he made a while ago, and I honestly really like this idea, even though it has a few flaws. There's some other possible reasons, such as orange being on the opposite side of the color spectrum from purple, symbolizing Afton's public appearance outside Freddy's, and the fact that if Afton was purple in the minigame, he'd blend in with the dark background and be essentially impossible to see. As to where William is driving back from, it's been widely agreed for a while now that he's speeding back from the scene of Charlotte Emily's death, which is shown to us in FNAF 6's Security Puppet minigame. The songs for both minigames are similar and share motifs in different keys, and they share the same rain effects throughout. We also know that Charlotte was killed at night, which makes the name Later That Night make more sense. And although we've got some very strong leads that basically confirm Afton is the Midnight Motorist driver and that he's driving home from the murder scene of Charlotte Emily, the other 4 questions I raised earlier are much harder to answer. So, let's do our best. Moving on to the second question. What's up with the pile of dirt in the clearing? The pile of dirt is the only really secret thing in this minigame. You'll never encounter it on a normal playthrough of later that night and have to actively go out looking for it. It can be found at the top point of the map by swerving off the road. All you see is a single mountain in the clearing surrounded by a darker outline of some sort. Now, there's several broad options as to what this is. It's either a corpse, an important location, or a secret of some kind. If this is the body of one of William's victims, we can rule out the missing children, as those were stuffed in the animatronics, as well as the DCI, if those deaths even happened. It's most likely one of his children, either Elizabeth or Crying Child, and those are the guesses people tend to lean to the most. If it's a location, the main options are the sister location bunker, with the mount being a covered-up entrance, or one of the twisted animatronics' graves. In the novel trilogy, we meet the Twisted Ones, who use illusion-disc technology to change their appearance. They only come out at night, burying themselves in mounds during the day. If it's a secret, a lot of people say it could be something tied to FNAF 4, like the Crying Child's plushies, Michael's Foxy mask, or something like that. But I think the contents of this mound are much more symbolic than we thought, and shouldn't be taken as literally as we think they are. FNAF has tried to end its story multiple times. First it was supposed to end with 3, then 4, then it's possible it would have ended with Sister Location, and then with FNAF 6, which was the ending of the Scott Games FNAF era. One of the most important details from any of these endings was the box from FNAF 4. After beating Night 7, you'd see a screen of a closed chest with interactable locks with the text, "Perhaps some things are best left forgotten for now." To this day, we have no idea what's in it or if it even matters, and Scott himself said in the latest doco interview that the contents of the box are no longer relevant to the modern story. So, what if this mound contains the box in both a literal and metaphorical way? Since the box comes from FNAF 4, a pretty Afton family-centric game, it makes sense for the box itself to be tied to the Aftons too. And since we just discussed how Midnight Motorist is about the Afton family, the box could be tied to them too. However, I think the Midnight Motorist mound is much less literal than we theorists tend to think it is. I think this mound contains the FNAF 4 box, but only metaphorically. The box symbolizes the ending of the original FNAF quadrilogy. This was where Scott wanted to end his franchise, and him burying that failed ending to be forgotten in this mysterious minigame sounds like exactly the kind of thing he'd do to mess with us. It's possible this is also literally the box, as it could contain Michael's Foxy mask, as we see a similar box to the Bonnie mask from the Bite of 83 in Help Wanted 2. Michael, traumatized by the death of his brother, would go out into the woods and bury his mask inside an old box. However, for reasons I'll get into later, I disagree. I don't think this mound is any of the other options I mentioned before for various reasons. To begin with, I don't think it's the Crying Child or Elizabeth's bodies, because I think Crying Child was given a proper burial since he was hospitalized, and Elizabeth was likely given one too since her father William didn't need to bring her back to life after she possessed Circus Baby, and also because she was Afton's favorite child, even though he was still abusive towards her. I don't think it's the Circus Baby's entertainment and rentals bunker, because the entrance to the bunker isn't hidden, as we see employees go into it during the gameplay of Sister Location, or something related to the Twisted Ones since they're not canon to the games, and because Midnight Motorist takes place during the night, meaning they would have already left the mound by the time we find it. In summary, I think the mound of dirt is both a meta element for the inclusion of Scott's failed ending for FNAF 4, and possibly a tangible thing in-universe. I'm not really willing to spend any more time thinking about this thing, so this is the answer I think is the best. And with that, we've already answered 2 of Midnight Motorist's biggest questions. Time to move on to the next one. What is the Juniors building? This next question is much harder to answer because we don't know anything about this part of Midnight Motorist. What the hell is Juniors, and why is it in the middle of a secluded forest, but is surrounded by cars in the parking lot, and even has someone who appears to be a bouncer standing outside? Also, why isn't William Afton, our player character, allowed into the building? Well, the most popular theory for this location's identity is that Juniors is a bar, and that the reason William can't enter is because he's drunk. This is also labeled as the reason why William went to kill Charlotte. He was so drunk he lost his mind and decided to lash out violently against Henry's only daughter. To be honest, the only other real theory to explain Juniors is that it's some kind of Freddy's location, and that's why William isn't allowed inside. But what would be the point of this? Juniors being a bar explains a lot about why this minigame is happening and why William is acting so differently from his usual calculating self. Meanwhile, Juniors being a Fazbear Entertainment location doesn't really explain anything and just makes this mess even more confusing. As for the green guy, he's totally also William Afton. Just don't question it. To be honest, I don't really have much to say about Juniors. It's undoubtedly the biggest question mark in this minigame, even though it's probably the least important aspect of it. So let's just assume it's a bar and move on to our next question. Who are the Runaway and the Couch Person? Most of you are probably aware that 2 characters can be interacted with once you reach your home. The Couch Person, who sits in what is probably a living room watching TV, and the Runaway, a mysterious male person, likely a child, who escapes the house through a broken window. So who are they? Well, I've been conflicted about the specific part of the minigame for a while now. If Midnight Motorist is about the Aftons, then these 2 have to be part of the Afton family. And there's really only 3 options for their identities: Mrs. Afton, Michael Afton, and the Crying Child. Elizabeth can't be the couch person because she would never talk to William in the way they do, and she can't be the runaway because the runaway is male. Essentially, the discussion boils down to either Mike or Cryingchild being the runaway, and either Mrs. Afton or Mike being the couch person, since obviously Mike can't be two people at the same time, which means he's either the runaway or the couch person. So, which one is he? The most common theory is that Michael is the runaway and that an unknown character like Mrs. Afton is the couch person. Michael runs away after seeing something outside the window, while his mother sits in the living room watching TV. However, I don't think this idea makes that much sense, because for a while now I theorized that Michael was the couch person. Michael is iconic for watching TV. He does it at the end of each night in Sister Location and even references this fact in his security logbook. It would make sense for him to watch TV here because Scott was obviously trying to tie FNAF 6 into the rest of the story, so connecting Michael's love of TV to this minigame does make sense. This would mean that the FNAF or Cryingchild, being the only other male Afton child, is the runaway. This has some interesting implications, which we'll get into in a bit. Anyway, why do I think Michael and Cryingchild fulfill these roles in the minigame? Well, aside from Michael's connection to TV, which I brought up earlier, I think Cryingchild fits the bill for the runaway pretty well. I've talked about this in a different video, but in one of the Fazbear Fright stories, Hide and Seek, we get an extremely interesting parallel to this minigame. In the story, we meet Toby, a lonely younger brother who's always bullied by his older brother Connor for being a weakling, and for being inferior to him in many ways. The two kids live alone with their dad since their mom mysteriously disappeared years ago. The older brother and their dad spend a lot of time bonding together over watching TV, and Toby often feels excluded. Toby always tries to beat his brother's high scores at the local Freddy's arcade, but never manages. Eventually, he finds an arcade cabinet that his brothers never played before called Hide and Seek, where your objective is to find Shadow Bonnie's hiding spot. He fails to beat the existing high score, and frustrated, he attacks the arcade and breaks it. Over the next few days, he notices Shadow Bonnie stalking him as his brother and friends become worried for his health, but embarrassed and always wanting to prove himself, Toby eventually breaks out of his house and ends his life. Does this sound familiar? You got the lonely younger brother, the bullying older brother who loves TV and who actually cares for his sibling, the semi-absent dad figure, the vision of something Freddy's related stalking the younger sibling, and him breaking out of his house. And this is where our final question comes into play: the identity of the footprints outside the house. I first proposed this theory late last year under the name of Seek MM, theorizing that the footprints belong to Shadow Bonnie like we see in the story I just talked about, and that the runaway was the Cryingchild. And while I still believe that last part to be true, I don't think the footprints belong to Shadow Bonnie anymore. That original theory had some flaws in explaining why the footprints belong to Shadow Bonnie, and in hindsight, I think there's an extremely obvious answer that makes way more sense. Shadow Freddy. We find out in FNAF 4 that Cryingchild is haunted by something he saw at Fredbear's, similarly to Toby, and I think the constant fear that Cryingchild feels while in Fredbear's is connected to Shadow Freddy, who is basically a battered version of Fredbear. In Ultimate Custom Night, Nightmare, the final boss of FNAF 4, whose names in the files is Shadow Freddy, says, "I am your wickedness made flesh." Since we're playing as Afton in Ultimate Custom Night, he's telling us that he's integrally connected to William. We see Shadow Freddy connected to him yet again in FNAF 3's Follow Me minigames, where he guides the animatronics to their doom. So what if what Cryingchild saw was William after committing a crime involving the Fredbear suit? A crime like an intentional springlock failure. This is why he's so afraid of Fredbears, why William is constantly stalking him, and why Shadow Freddy is tied to both Cryingchild and his father. This is why he runs out of the house when Shadow Freddy appears outside. As to where he's running off to, he's probably going to Freddy's like we see Toby do. Everything makes sense, at least to me. And just like that, we've pieced together all the major points of the Midnight Motorist minigame. So let's start from the beginning and explain what's going on here. In the late 1983, William Afton gets drunk at a local bar and goes to a Freddy Fazbear's Pizza location to kill Shawn and Emily. On the way back, he stops by a mysterious mound of dirt in the clearing where a strange box is buried underneath. Weird. He also stops by Junior's for a drink, but William, the bouncer outside, doesn't let him in. He drives home and finds his son Michael watching his favorite show. William finds out that Cryingchild has locked himself in his room again. Drunk and angry, William goes outside and sees two mysterious footprints in the ground, and those of his child walking away from the house, the window shattered from the inside. Ran off to that place again. He'll be sorry when he gets back. This is what I think Midnight Motorist was actually about, and what Scott Cawthon wanted it to mean. It explains the dynamics of the Afton family, gives Shadow Freddy some plot relevance, and ties back to FNAF 2 and 3. Hell, Shadow Freddy even appears in FNAF 6's intro cutscene, so surely he has to be important to this, right? This interpretation also explains how abusive William is, and the direct aftermath of Charlie's death. But what do you think? I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments. Just remember to keep it respectful, and to be nice to each other, and to me. Please consider liking and subscribing if you enjoyed, and be sure not to miss my other videos and the live theory crafting streams. That'll be all from me.